Hello and welcome to Building Energy Futures Now. We'll be kicking off in just a couple of minutes. We're going to be joined today by Dr. Richard Miller, who I can see has already joined us on the chat. But Richard, if you're watching, can you scroll to the bottom and just ping me an invite, because I think it might actually bring you in with a bit more reliability actually if you send me the invite from inside your end, and I will look out for it and then I'll accept it and then it should ping you in. Now today we're going to be talking about building better energy futures now, and we're going to be drawing on Richard's extensive experience in the arena. I'm just accepting his invite now, so we should see him pop up behind us any moment. Sometimes it takes just a couple of seconds for this to actually bring people in. There he is. Hello, Richard. How are you?
Hi there. Just frantically pressing the wrong buttons, obviously.
Don't worry, it's so easy. It did actually just occur to me that it would probably actually be a bit more reliable if you pinged into me, because I found that when I try and ping out to others, sometimes the app's a bit more glitchy. But I'm delighted to have you in the session today. Known of your work a long time. You're basically my go-to man on a number of subjects. But for the benefit of those people that are joining us that don't know who you are and what you do, you're the founder of Klein Miller. You have worked extensively with Innovate UK, Future Cities, Catapult. Tell us a bit more about what you do, Richard, and about where you came from.
Okay, so I trained originally as a chemist, and for over 40 years now, I've been in and around the space of industrial R&D and innovation. And I started off working with major chemicals companies, consumer chemicals companies, and since 2001, I've been running my own consulting business, looking at innovation and sustainability. And the reason I got into sustainability was I had a job as R&D director of a chemical company that was using natural materials as a feedstock. So it was all about using natural oils and fats to make a bewildering array of chemicals. And so you sort of started off with, okay, we're all right because we're natural. And then you began to realize that there were significant sustainability issues to do with that. You got right immediately into the palm oil debate, sustainable palm oil, land use, all of those problems. And so I began to work with the company and began to look at the issues of sustainability. And I became director of sustainability for that company. And I think I was probably one of the first people to get that title, certainly in the UK environment. And then I sort of took that into my own practice. And as you said, became closely involved with Innovate UK, particularly dealing with issues of decarbonising the built environment. But I was working with other companies on issues of sustainability in the chemical sector, sustainability in buildings. I worked on future cities. I worked on agriculture and food and thinking about how you shift that in a more sustainable direction, but always trying to balance these kind of twin pillars of innovation and sustainability, because at one level, innovation is just innovation. And you have to do it right if you're going to be a success. But also, if you're doing it with sustainability in mind, there are some wrinkles, there are some ways you approach the problem, there are some special things you need to think about in order to be successful. So I've spent most of the time over the last 20 years balancing those two aspects. How do you innovate successfully, and how do you innovate sustainably at the same time?
Brilliant. And in the time that you've worked in the industry, because obviously it's now many, many years that you've been working at the interface of innovation and sustainability, and as you say, across wide-ranging arenas, chemistry, chemicals industry, energy, built environment. What are the major shifts that you've really seen in that time? If you had to pick out, let's say, 5 big shifts.
Well, one big shift has simply been the issue of focus, how seriously this is taken. So I started when, I guess, I'm not even sure COP had started yet, but we were at the very early stages of the IPCC reviews. And so the issue of climate change, in a curious way, we've come full circle. Because when I started, biodiversity, land use, and impact on the environment in that way was probably more at the front of people's minds in the industries I worked in than energy and carbon emissions were. And so you've seen that shift, and you see it become a mainstream topic. And it's now, you know, part of the conversation in the way that it certainly wasn't, you know, sort of 30 years ago. When I started thinking about these things. So that's one. I think the other one has been the fantastic development in technology. And we sometimes forget how bizarre it sounded 25, 30 years ago to say we would be producing in the UK half of our energy from wind on a windy day. I mean, that was just bonkers. I think, you know, 25 years ago, we had 2 prototype wind turbines in the UK. And so the focus on making those renewable technologies work and as a result, seeing the costs come down. And I think from about, so if we look at 2010-ish, the cost of PV globally was about $300 per megawatt hour. It's now kind of 30 to 40. The wind turbines have come dramatically down in price. You know, a similar sort of factor. The battery technology, storage technology has collapsed in prices. And what all that means is that we're now in a situation where across most of the globe, renewable energy for new capacity, you know, not keeping the existing plants going, but for new capacity, renewable energy is the cheapest way of doing it in virtually every scenario. And that has had a profound effect because it's got people thinking about it differently. You move to a more distributed network, the whole concept of what the grid is for and what it does changes. So I think that's a big change. I think, you know, net zero, a focus point. We're actually saying, no, we're not talking about trying to save carbon. We're talking about getting rid of it altogether from our economy. I mean, that's a huge, huge shift. And I think those are probably the big ones. And perhaps the last one is that you can have a sensible conversation about this topic with most people, with most businesses. It's part of their thinking. They're there, they're talking about it. They're saying, okay, so what are the issues for us? How are we going to deal with this? You go talk to local authorities and they've declared a climate emergency and they're trying to think about what a net zero transition means for them. And so they're kind of pushing in that direction. Where I think we have work to do, and it's the closing the loop again, is in issues like biodiversity and other forms of environmental impact. There is a risk that carbon has become the only thing we talk about. And then we don't talk about how we are going to handle water use and water stress with changing climates and also increasing population density in many parts of the world. We don't necessarily think about natural services, nature services, and how we value those and how we think about them. And I know talking to businesses that they kind of go, okay, yeah, I see that we're dependent on ecological services because we're in the food industry and we need pollinators or things like that. And lots of people kind of get the basic idea, but they struggle to know what to do about it. I think with carbon, you can have a conversation about what's your plan? Let me help you create a plan. Have you thought about this? Let's work through the issues. Bang, bang, bang. And you can have a carbon conversation. We're still at a point where trying to have an integrated sustainability conversation is kind of quite difficult. So that would be, for me, the next phase, is how we kind of bring these other things in so that we don't become so obsessed by carbon that we do damage elsewhere. And we do have to think about pollinators. We do have to think about eco services. We do have to think about natural capital and all these different issues, and things like the, you know, the rewilding movement that's going on in the UK and parts of Europe at the moment. Very important, because one of the things it's going to do is going to help us cope with the future storms that we face. You know, I live in North Wales. The uplands are pretty bare, and when it rains, the water comes hurtling down and creates all kinds of problems. So, you know, thinking about rewilding as a way of using eco-services more effectively to make our lives more viable and comfortable is is just beginning, I think. Integration, I think, you know, the systems thinking is easily talked about, but it's actually very, very hard to do. And we're all trained in silos. We all work in silos. In business and in government, people break things down into bite-sized pieces because that's how people can actually cope with the immensity of the challenges. But then you get departments and groups that are dealing with one particular aspect of the problem, and they're not necessarily looking at that integrative aspect. And I don't know how to do that. It's very, very difficult.
I see a lot of parallels, and I agree exactly with what you're saying. I think another good example for energy is hydro dams. If we look to Africa, for example, we find that one of the discussions that isn't talked about with respect to hydro dams and, you know, power from hydro is the fact that on the one hand, yes, you can make a lot of power through that source, but then the studies, and these don't have enough visibility, are that, of course, the water bodies become breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other zoonotic carrying species that then spread malaria and other diseases. And so there's a very strong correlation between disease outbreaks and hydro dams. Then, of course, we've got the conflict issues, need we say Ethiopia and Sudan. And of course, if we look to China and we look at the damage that the hydro dams have done in China, you've got both the ecological damage in that obviously the change in the hydrological systems has caused a very distinct change in the landscape. We've seen species extinctions, and of course we've seen the impact of people. So I think absolutely, I think we need more systems lenses and we need more tools. And I think one of the big problems with systems is a lot of people, ironically, you know, they don't really learn from the sort of old Einstein quote that, you know, you can't solve a problem by applying the same problem that created it. And we see a lot of people trying to delineate systems thinking through very simplistic diagrams, through bullet points. And the reality is, as you say, this is a cultural shift. This is actually working in different ways. There are different ways you can do that, but it is complex. And I'd say probably the big quality I notice in systems thinking is you have to allow more time. You must absolutely not rely on assumptions. So you've got to ask more questions than, you know, make assumptions. You've got to assume that you know less than you do know. And I think the sort of setup that we have now is not currently working for that. But I think we could tweak it, because I think, for example, you know, when you look to academia, when you scroll through, let's say, the grant applications, a lot of them are very siloed. That could obviously be changed. That's just writing a new brief. And I hope with industry, I'd really like to see industry actually putting the bandwidth there for more complex thinking. And so, as you'll know, within our foresight area, we get approached by a lot of people wanting reports. But of course, the quality of a report depends very much on the timeline and the budget that you've got. What I found I've had a lot of the last several years is companies coming to me wanting sound bites, wanting the future to be reductionist and condensed, when actually to do these subjects justice, you've actually got to allow more time. You've actually got to think about beginning a conversation rather than assuming that in that one piece of work, you're actually going to complete it. So
I think that one of the key problems with trying to bring systems thinking into these complex issues is, as humans, we have a terrible tendency to make things linear and stepwise. And so people often want to know, so what do I do first? And then what do I do after that? And what's the next step? And they want it reduced to a linear process. And of course, it's not like that, because one of the key things about introducing systems thinking to anything is thinking much more in terms of stocks and flows and less about inputs and outputs. because that black box model of input, something happens to it, output, bang, job done, that reductionist approach doesn't really tackle these problems. And you can look at these, all over the place, not just in Africa. You can look at it in the Western United States, which is deep in drought. It turns out that when they divided up the waters of the Colorado River for agriculture and things across the different states that Colorado runs through, they just calmly allocated 1.5 times as much water as was there. Yeah.
Easy mistake to make.
Well, on the grounds that nobody wanted that much water, so they just divvied it up that way, and they never bothered to do the addition. So what I discovered is also water for irrigation in the US is measured in acre feet. That's an acre of land covered completely in 1 foot of water. And I did actually work out how many cubic meters that was, but it's quite a lot. But they are thousands of acre feet out, even before you put in issues with the snowpack in the mountains and whether the Colorado is really going to be getting all that water in the future. What's going to happen to the Central Valley in California, where all the agriculture is. These are problems which arose because people didn't think it mattered when they made strategic decisions. And my suspicion is that if you looked at the abstraction licenses for water in the UK, you would see exactly the same problem, that actually nobody's really added it up and said, how much water can we afford to take? And that has direct and powerful implications. One of the cities in the UK that wants to grow is Norwich. It has business, it's an attractive place to live, it's got all kinds of benefits. It wants to increase the size of its population, and it can't. And the reason it can't is it's got no water. In the UK, and in fact, some of the water that it does have is pumped from a considerable distance away, or is actually moved from one river catchment to another by giant pumps. So, when we make those, I understand why people do it in a reductionist way. It makes it tractable. But we are in a situation now where we are reaping the whirlwind of that kind of reductionist thinking in a whole range of areas. And we now have to find ways of bringing all those conversations into one. We're still building houses kind of more or less at random. We don't have plans for our cities. We're still subsidizing things that in the long term we know make no sense because we can't figure out how to unpick the situation. So yeah, I think the systems thing is a task as yet incomplete. And I struggle myself. This is seriously hard stuff. Anybody who tells you that systems thinking on real systems is easy is kidding themselves.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I often see in architecture is a lot of people talking about new paradigms and supposedly ecological approaches. Now, of course, ecologies are systems. They're just one of many kinds, aren't they? And they're interfacing with other systems, where what they're actually doing is they're dressing up modernism. They're dressing up a school of thinking that was belligerent to its surroundings, but for the most modest of considerations of how it might harness things like the light or solar power. And they're sort of dressing up this old idea as being new. And it strikes me that with city thinking, that again is a problem, because people are thinking in terms of permanency, they're thinking in terms of, as you say, just building it and then assuming that everything else can be modified in a way that's going to enable that city to stand. Whereas if we think to the past, for most of human culture, when we built any kind of a settlement, obviously the very early sort of incarnations of settlement and the sort of mammoth little tents made of the mammoth bones, and then we sort of moved it on to other kinds of animal skin and then eventually arrived at working with stone and so forth. We nonetheless, even when we were working with stone, even in sort of between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the cities would move. They would move over time, and the people who built them actually accepted this. They designed that into, as it were, their building schema. They had avatar cities for partly this purpose. The avatar city, the dream city, was, if you like, the city blueprint. It was the ideal city. And so that always existed off in the sort of the mind, the imagination. And then they would actually have physical cities that they would, not obviously year on year, but they would actually move about. The Egyptians, we know, did it. We know the Egyptians moved whole cities when the rivers changed their course. But of course, we today are in a totally different situation because, you know, we couldn't, for example, move London, could we? But it's not just at that grand scale. We build for permanency, and flows are all about changes. They're all about shifts in where the material is and so on.
And of course, for very good reason, we built on rivers and on coasts, because ship and boat is an extremely efficient means of early transport. And so now we face those problems that we've chosen to build many really important cities in places that are going to struggle with climate change, and how are we going to manage that? And I think there's an interesting thing. I don't know when the flip happened, but many cities, say from the medieval period onwards, their fundamental layout has a remarkable persistence. So you can take a map of the City of London from before the Great Fire, and you can lay it over the City of London today, and the streets are exactly the same. The buildings have all changed, but the thoroughfares, the arteries, the network of the city has stayed exactly the same. And I think that's true of a hell of a lot of cities. And it raises interesting questions about how do you modify? How do you adapt and change a thing like a city? You know, because it has this persistence, this difficulty of making substantial change.
And I agree. I think we can learn a lot from the City of London, because obviously when the Great Fire happened, Charles II commissioned the greatest thinkers of the age, the Robert Hookes, the Christopher Wrens, the John Evelyns, all came along. They designed these extraordinary future cities for London with very different street plans, with very different plans. But as you say, what actually happened is the populace rejected that and they reverted to the original schema. And, you know, on the surface level, you could think, well, that's just people being belligerent. That's just people rejecting change. But obviously, the thing about cities and about London is that it obviously emerged organically. So there is a reason why certain roads and other infrastructure are where they are. And so I think that that's interesting in the sort of context of future cities, because there are many, many people that come along and imagine that the future city can be drawn from the foundations and that the future city is all sparkly and new. But what we're learning from that case study is that actually the future city is already here. It's just it's going to be augmented over time.
I think very few designed cities have been successes. I think, you know, Brasilia, you know, not really kind of great. Washington kind of works okay as a deliberate. I mean, they did put it in a swamp, which wasn't terribly helpful. But you know, but in general, these attempts to say, right, we'll move the capital and we'll plonk it down over here, those have not been roaring successes. Very few of those places have developed their own personality and become, if you like, self-sustaining. Perhaps Chandigarh is an example. I can't even remember which state that's the capital of, but that was actually invented because the partition of India meant that they had to move the capital of the state because the state was divided in two. And that was built out of, you know, thin air by famous European architects who kind of came in and said, this is how it should be. But somehow it has become a success. But the outer parts of it do not look like the European vision. They do look like an Indian city.
Absolutely. And what about, I mean, I'm thinking to the UK, obviously there was Milton Keynes is probably the best example I can think of a city that is new and that has worked. Do you think there's anything that we can, you know, learn from Milton Keynes as a city that was sort of built?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Milton Keynes is very successful. because they gave it space. What it probably lacks in terms of the cities we need for the future is it's not dense enough. And so the interesting question becomes, how do you take a concept like Milton Keynes with nice wide boulevards and all the rest of it, and how do you densify it? Because for a lot of people, and that, you know, how do you make it walkable? I mean, there's no way in which Milton Keynes could be a 15-minute city. I mean, it's completely incomprehensible. You couldn't do it. It is a car-based city. Okay, they've got good bike paths now, and they've worked on it, but it is essentially one conceived of as a car-based city. And so, how do you make those transitions? How would you take a Los Angeles and make it, less totally dependent on the car? What would you have to do to it? How would you change it? I think there's really interesting questions there about what is needed to adapt our cities, because that's what we're going to have to do. I don't think we're largely going to be building new cities. I think we're going to be adapting cities, and the question of how you think that through, how you think about the energy system, how you think about the communication system, how you think about all the infrastructure. I mean, actually, Canary Wharf is quite an interesting example, because one thing that Canary Wharf had was that one development company owned the whole thing, and it was an empty site. And what that enabled them to do was actually think through the services and infrastructure at the same time as they were planning the buildings. So you kind of, they've got a much more sensible structure for how the services run to the buildings and how they're organized. I mean, in general, in the UK, one of the statistics that always astonishes me is the UK has 4 million kilometers of buried infrastructure, and we dig 4 million holes a year to look after it. And there's a kind of certain nice symmetry about that, but that's just kind of insane. And why is that? It's because everything was done, piecemeal and step by step, and without thinking it through. And if I'm not careful, I'm arguing myself to the position of saying, no, architects and planners should design the whole thing and then we should just do it. And we know that doesn't work either. So where is the balance between the organic and the emergent and the design so we don't screw things up?
And I must admit, I think one of the big sort of trends, obviously, we saw in cities and in planning and with architecture of the last few centuries is colonialism. We obviously saw ideas that were posited as being new, that had emerged in the global north, exported around the world, off to all the colonies. Obviously, one of the ironies is that many of the ideas that were posited as being radical were in fact within the indigenous architectures, but were never credited, weren't even noticed in some cases. But the other thing is, when I travel around the cities of the world, I look to sort of what their weaknesses and what their strengths are. And although it can look rather ugly, one of the things I've noticed when you're in Asia is you will often see the power lines are above the city. They're sort of, particularly I'm thinking to the Philippines and to India, you'll sort of be walking down the street and there's all these sort of black wires that are the power and all the other infrastructure, which is partly up there because of the fact that these were, they're archaic cities, they're very old cities, so they didn't embed this stuff in the same sort of patchwork way that they did in the UK and other places, but also because of the flooding, because of course when the torrential flood comes along, as they invariably do in monsoonal regions, when the infrastructure's up there, it's meters high, then it's out of the floodwaters. Now, I'm not saying that we should necessarily do that in Britain, but it does strike me that we do tend to have this situation where we just keep doing everything we've done before. And it would be interesting if we started to sort of experiment and to afford for those spaces where we could actually try and work out, well, might we put something somewhere else? Or, how might we do that? And of course, particularly now we're in the age when, you don't even have to plug your phone in to charge it, do you? Just pop it on its little, there are new ways of sort of having power infrastructure. So I do wonder what we might do. What do you think are some of the most exciting ways that we might, as it were, restructure our power and our energy networks?
Well, I think the really interesting thing that's happening anyway is the decentralization. So centralized power grids have served us very, very well. Right? So a small number, a relatively small number of large power stations, and then it all feeds out from that dendritically to the end users. And there are problems with that. I live in the countryside in a rural area, and we're at the end of the line. So we're more likely for things to go wrong. If you suddenly decide you need 3-phase for your farmhouse because you want to put in a ground source heat pump or something, then that's a kind of serious ask. It's not just kind of, yeah, we'll hook you up. This is like, okay, it's going to cost you £20,000 in running the cables from the nearest point that we can take it from and run it to your property. And people are daisy chained on power, and there's all kinds of things that make life difficult. But in general, and particularly for built up areas, the central feeding out dendritically model has worked extremely well. It's enabled us to have very big power stations. It's enabled things like nuclear power to be relatively easily used. And now we're transitioning to a model in which the unit of generation is a completely different size. I mean, even if it's a wind farm, particularly if it's an onshore wind farm, it's pretty small compared to the power stations we're used to. If it's a solar farm, yeah, it's big as a solar farm, but it's not huge. And when we get down to, I've got solar on my roof, many other people have as well, you're talking about a very, very different way of doing things. And that is changing the way we think about grid connectivity. Not, I would suggest, fast enough, but it is changing it. And so an example I like is the Johan Cruyff Stadium in Amsterdam. So it's a typical stadium. It's open in the middle. It's got a kind of grass area. They can have rock concerts there. They can cover it. And it's got roughly oval shape and a big roof area covering the stands. That roof area is covered in PV. They also have, and I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like 300 second life Nissan Leaf batteries under the pitch. So they can run an evening event, whether it's floodlighting soccer and running all the services, or whether it's a rock concert or whatever, they can run off the power they've collected during the day.
That's awesome.
More than that, they're connected to the local housing estates, and they are trading energy with the housing estates, which also have PV on the roofs. And they're experimenting with vehicle to grid in the car parks. So highly dynamic. And what that means is not only can they run fairly independently, but they're also making money out of offering grid services like frequency stabilization and stopping voltage sag to the wider Dutch national grid. Now that's a kind of, it's a fairly complex example, but that's the way we should be thinking about individual properties. What does my village look like as a power source and sink? It's back to the stocks and flows argument again. And electricity and water and things like that, perfect for stocks and flows thinking. So what can we generate? How much do we use? When do we use it? How can we rebalance it? Some of us have got batteries, some haven't. How do we fit all that into the scenario? I live just down the road from De Norwich, which is called Electric Mountain. And in the 1980s, it was the largest, I think, pumped hydro storage facility in Europe. Essentially, it was a slate mine at the top of the mountain and a lake at the bottom, and they're connected to, and it has, it's very impressive from an engineering point of view. It has the biggest dam valves I have ever seen in my life. The main inlet pipes are kind of twice a man tall. And it can go from a standing start to flat out production of tens of megawatts in less than 30 seconds. And it was one of the places that always used to be part of the management of the UK national grid, where, because of the way our television worked, where you had defined limited number of channels and defined ad breaks. And when the adverts came on, everyone would immediately rush into the kitchen and turn on their 3 kilowatt electric kettles. There was a man in Norwich with his finger poised over a button, watching to see what was happening in Coronation Street, a popular soap opera, probably the most popular soap opera at the time. Right, they'd gone to adverts, bang, because we're going to need suddenly a huge increase in power. And I think that's, you know, all of those things, it's going to be a different grid. It's going to be a different network. It's going to operate in a different way. And I think that's one of the challenges, because at the one hand, the people who run the national grid and the power stations and delivering all the rest of it and the DNOs and all those people, they've got to keep the thing going the way it is at the moment, right? So actually they're redesigning the locomotive whilst it's barreling down the track. And you have to be very, very careful which nut you undo in those circumstances. So it's a difficult problem, but it's going to happen. It must happen. It will happen. Things will go wrong while it's changing. But that switch from a centralized model, you could argue it's going back to, you know, the way, say, electric power started, or even water started, when, you know, every hamlet, every town, every village was responsible, every building was responsible for their own water supply, for their own sewage, their own waste disposal, and their own power. And so you look at, I can't remember, the Cragside, that's it, Cragside in Northumberland, which was the dwelling of Armstrong, who was the first person to put in electric supply to an individual house in the UK. And he had, it was hydro generated, he had quite a large estate, and he had a convenient stream running down the side. But that was, you know, there was no grid, there was no network. He took the energy he was producing out of the stream in his garden, and that's what he ran the house with. Then we kind of got, like, you know, much more resilient if we kind of grid everybody together, share the resources. Once we've got a grid, it makes sense to have big power stations, and nuclear power stations, things like that need to be big to be efficient. So let's go that way. And now we're talking about small modular reactors. We're talking about a whole range of different solutions, because how you generate and use energy in particular is changing in front of our eyes. And I think that's one of the big changes that we'll see is, and how do we navigate that? You know, and there are many solutions. There are multiple approaches to fixing that problem. I've no idea which one's going to win out. You know, will it be time of use tariffs? Will it be feeding back to the grid? Will it be vehicle to grid type situations? What's it going to be? Is it going to be comfort as a service, heat as a service? Instead of actually number of kilowatts, it's going to be, well, actually I want 20 degrees in the evening in my home or in my office or whatever. So I think that's going to create significant change, and I have no idea what direction it's going to go in.
I mean, for me, it's interesting, you know, living between the UK and France, because I see essentially that the sort of quite significant differences in the energy innovation and how they're sort of structuring it and rolling it out at the national level. And in France, for example, the family property there, we have just had heat pumps put in. We've had 2 large heat pumps put in. And that was a conscious decision, because for our very particular kind of property, that made sense. But it's also augmented. So, for example, we will be getting solar. We won't be putting it on the roof, because one of the big problems where we are is they have major storm systems. And although the topography suggests, touch wood, we're not in the river, the river of weather that typically carries this particular kind of storm. Just up the road from us, 20 minutes away, last year, there was a major storm that released hailstones the size of tennis balls, and that smashed 4,500 roofs of the local houses to bits. So needless to say, all of the solar that was on those roofs got completely destroyed. And so, you know, we're looking at solar, but we're obviously looking at solar that we can protect. We've got a wood burner. We don't beat ourselves up about it, because we don't use the wood burner very often. So it's more of a backup. It's just there if, you know, and the wood is coming literally from half a mile up the road. So, you know, it's a bit of a balance. It's a mixed scenario. But one of the things that the French government has done very well is that they allow sort of particularly people that are in rural areas, one of a number of grants. The process of getting the grant is very, very quick. Our property didn't actually qualify, but we have friends that have been able to get heat pumps for €1. So that's not even £1. That's what, like 85p to have heat pumps installed. They had very similar, they had the same for installation. We have a friend who's just had his €1 heat pumps fitted. He had €1 installation 2 years ago because the French government rolled out a major installation program. You know, various other kinds of energy, again, are guessing. And people are finding it. The only complexity in France is because of the fact that there's such a diversity of housing stock and also buildings more generally. The process of actually finding the expert that is going to give you the right decision is a little bit tricky, because obviously, as in any commercial market, every Tom, Dick and Harry is trying to push their services. So you have to be a bit, but it has been very, very efficient. And so I was really pleased to see that the UK is now going to try and push ahead with heat pumps, because certainly we know people have been using for several years in France, and they work really, really well. And it sort of feels like a no-brainer. You know, you're basically just making energy out of the air, aren't you? It's, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there, you know, some of these technologies, and again, heat pumps is an example being talked about much more. I mean, you have to be ready for it, and sometimes there are challenges. In my own property, we looked at heat pumps, and the cost was mounting. So this was a couple of years back. The cost was mounting so rapidly that you were genuinely looking at a situation where the chances of my wife and I surviving long enough for the payback were kind of vanishingly small. So there are issues like that. I mean, I think the interesting thing also that comes out of what you said is that because we are experiencing more severe weather events more frequently, you have to kind of, you know, you're attacking a moving target, because your climate is changing in a way that actually threatens some of the solutions that you have for dealing with climate change. And that kind of complexity is also there, that people are looking for simple answers. Politicians in particular want simple answers, but also consumers. And I, as a consumer, you know, I want someone to tell me how to do it. And one thing that France and also Germany have done very well has been created one-stop shops. So there's a program, it's called Haute de France, for a particular region of France, that actually provides, you know, subsidized loans. It provides expertise. You go to them, they'll send a qualified person who will inspect your property, have a discussion with you about what you want to do and what you can afford and how it's all going to work. They will source the money, they will source the contractors to do the work, and they will check that it's been done correctly. Right? Germany has a similar thing called Kreditenstalt für Wiederaufbau. That's been running for a number of years, and it's exactly the same thing. You know, it's low-cost loans, but much more important, they'll look after you. You know, you don't have to be the project manager yourself. You don't have to navigate the civil service and the forms and all the rest of it. It's a one-stop shop. You say, I want to do this, and you come up with a plan, they agree with you, and then the plan is executed. And that's something which we have never approached in the UK, is the ability to do that. And I think those countries which have done that are the ones making progress. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
Other countries, some of the Scandinavian countries, have had incredibly strict building regulations, which have also kind of pushed them in a certain direction. But you know what it's like in the UK. We have old houses, just like France, and we like old houses, and so that actually kind of slows down the process. But at the moment, the other thing which is a problem in the UK is we have a government that keeps changing its mind. So we had the Code for Sustainable Homes, which went for a number of years, that had a stepwise improvement so that you could only build homes to certain escalating standard year by year. Every couple of years they'd turn it up another notch. That was the plan. And the industry spent, quite honestly, a couple of years saying, act casual, say nothing, keep your head down, it will go away. The government will never stick to it. And the government, to their credit, did stick to it. And so people started doing the design work. And I was working with Innovate UK at the time, and we were able to provide support funding to help house builders try out solutions and find, how are we going to get to this improved performance at the same price, because it has to be at the same price. And good progress was made. And then in 2015, they just said, oh, to hell with it, we're canning the whole program. And so all those people who'd invested literally millions in developing the capability against that policy objective, well, it's going to be hard to persuade them to do it again. And so when we got to Green Deal and a number of other support mechanisms, they were kind of dead on arrival, because people were just saying, well, we remember what you did to us last time. So I think that's something that other countries have done much better, is to have a consistent policy and to stick to it. And I think that's the most important thing that the UK needs to do if it is serious. We've got 27 million existing homes that need to be upgraded, and we're still building new homes that will have to be upgraded before 2050. Can you imagine that? We're still building homes that are not ready for 2050. How bonkers is that?
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. One of the things, for those people that don't know, you are also on Twitter, and you are a Twitter ninja. One of the things I love is you fire at misinformation that is being targeted to those that are championing sustainable renewables. You go in there like Bruce Lee and you take them down with the facts. So do follow Richard on Twitter if you don't already. You will love watching him,
Yeah, but it is interesting, because sometimes it feels like a never-ending task, because basically they're not going to give in to facts.
No.
Facts are irrelevant. They're not going to give in to facts. And so the one I was dealing with in the last couple of days is somebody who runs under the Steve Malloy, who runs under the name Junk Science, has been showing the surface temperatures for the last 8 years from NOAA and people like that, and saying, look, there's no climate change. And you kind of go, yeah, but if you expand the scale to look at 50 years, you can see the climate change. Yeah, it keeps going flat or dropping a little bit for a couple of years, because there's this thing called ocean currents, right? Yeah. There's the whole ENSO thing, and the turnover of the oceans, and La Nina and El Nino. And what they've done is they've just taken a little window and said, see, there's no climate change. And you think, that level of dishonesty, I mean, I can cope with the people who are ill-informed, but to actually pretend that that's a contribution to the debate, I find just appalling.
Yeah.
But that very picture keeps popping up, 5 times a day. Look, you see, it's not real. Yes, it is. Just expand the scale and you can see it.
Yeah, absolutely. My pet hate is Bjorn Lomborg. It gets my goat that people keep inviting him to debates, to say even the discussion, when his books are just full of misrepresentations of science, when it's clear he doesn't actually understand fundamental aspects of the science. And, yet he's being made this sort of anti-climate superstar and being given this exposure. I think it's a great shame. And I do rather wonder if, a lot of agents represent him. And I do wonder how they can reconcile that with the fact that they're pushing themselves as being pro-sustainability. Because if you are really pro-sustainability, what are you doing promoting a climate denier? you know, it's a problem. But as you say, there are some people that you can actually bring with you on the journey. You can give them the facts, and then hopefully they will reconsider that position. And then there are other people that will push the facts.
Yes, it's part of their worldview, and you're not going to change that. You can usually spot them because they get pretty offensive after the first couple of exchanges. The other thing I think that goes with that, which is another part of the problem. So now we've reached a situation where people are seeing renewable energy being used. They're seeing renewable energy making a major contribution to energy demand in many, many countries around the world. They're seeing, you know, China having more planned wind investment than pretty much the whole of the rest of the developed world for next year alone. It's happening, and it's happening because it makes economic sense. And that's one of the great things that government has been able to contribute to it. I'm a great fan of Mariana Mazzucato and her, you know, thinking about the entrepreneurial state, the way in which state support to innovation has a profound impact. You know, stuff gets picked up when often the bones have been sorted out by publicly funded research. And so renewable energy is a classic example of that. And many countries around the world have worked hard to kind of figure out how to apply it, figure out how to make it work. And as a result, we've seen the cost collapse. I am still seeing people writing tweets saying, yeah, but you know, you do realize that the sun doesn't shine at night and sometimes the wind doesn't blow. And you kind of go, well, yeah. And that means, but their logic is, and that means for every megawatt of renewable power you have on the grid, you have to have a megawatt of fossil fuel energy on standby in case it's not working. You kind of think, where are they coming from? You know, I mean, they clearly have no appreciation of how the grid has always worked. Like I said, in 1984, they built the Denolwick power, you know, pumped hydro unit. You know, we've been building pumped hydro since the middle of the 19th century to provide backup for unreliable electricity generation. The solutions are out there. There's lots and lots. I got so annoyed about it that I've ended up writing a series of blogs just on, look, here are all the technologies, right? Yeah. This is not some random thing. And by the way, if you have geographic diversity and technological diversity of energy generation, then most of the problems of dealing with, you know, no wind just vanish because somewhere the wind's blowing. There are very, very rare occurrences where we do have, you know, sort of very stable sudden weather systems over big chunks of Europe, which is a problem. To be fair, when that happens, usually the sun is shining. But, you know, the wind does stop blowing for a period. So, of course, we need backup, but we've always needed backup. Power stations go offline for all kinds of reasons. They go off for planned maintenance. They go off because the grid connections fail. There's a problem. They go off because there's an unexpected outage. I mean, what have we had recently? 50% of France's nuclear capacity offline. 50%, you know, and France is 75% nuclear power.
And I can assert there was no interruption of service. No, well, I know at all. Business. In fact,
what EDF told me a few years ago is that they do have a system, and I don't know if it applies in the area you're in, where they can switch the power off at parts of the day.
Yeah.
And basically they tell people, don't try running your washing machine in the afternoon because we're going to run the power down to balance it. And then people are compensated for the fact with cheaper bills that they can't do it. But that is certainly used in parts of France. I mean, and the whole load leveling debate, which is why people are interested in things like vehicle to grid, when you think how much power is going to be locked up in battery electric vehicles. But the whole thing about load leveling, peak shaving, all those kinds of debates, there's loads of different ways of doing it. You know, the time of use tariffs, all those kinds of things. I mean, time of use tariffs are not, as they're seen by some people, a fundamental attack on your human rights. You know, they're a sensible thing, and if you use them well, you make money out of it. Yeah. It becomes profitable, you know. And people can be just, you know, advised when to run certain things if it helps. You know, I mean, I tend to run my washing machine, and I have a tumble dryer because I'm in North Wales and it rains a hell of a lot here. I have a washing machine and tumble dryer, and they go on at night because just by that simple decision, I'm helping the grid. I charge my electric vehicle at night. I don't charge it during the peak hours of the day, even though I'm not getting any discount, simply because it doesn't make any difference to me. And I can just help the process by those simple choices. This is all soluble. And we have loads and loads, you know, there are, I think I counted 7 different, fundamentally different ways of storing spare renewable energy.
Did you? I was going to get onto storage. So yeah, tell us about the several different ways.
Well, we've talked about pumped hydro, which interestingly dominates completely at the moment in global storage. Over 95% of total global storage capacity is pumped hydro because it's dead easy to do. The engineering is well understood. And if you've got the right kind of landscape, it's kind of straightforward. Now, so what you're doing is you're moving mass against gravity. That's how you're storing the energy. Other people are thinking of ways in which you can use the same idea, but without actually having to have a valley with a lake at the top or a mountain that's hollow and all these kinds of things. And so people are experimenting with other different gravity forms. And one of them is simply you have a big heavy weight and a mine shaft, and you winch it up when you have spare electricity. And then when you want the energy back, you let it run back down like the weights on a grandfather clock. And it turns the winch the other way, and it runs the dynamo, and you generate electricity. You know, so you can't do, it's not as big as you can do with pumped hydro, but you know, it's there, you can use it. There's a company in the United States where they've got more space that actually has mine cars that are winched up and down an incline. Exactly the same. So you winch them up to the top when you've got spare electricity, you let them run back down again, turning the dynamo when you want the power back. So people are messing around with ideas like that, and that's just, so there's many different ideas just in the kind of lifting weights against gravity. Yeah. There's some kind of slightly bonkers one. There's a Swiss company that has an idea of automated cranes lifting very heavy concrete blocks and building a tower, and then taking the tower apart again when you want the electricity back. So you lift the blocks up, and then when you want it. So, but to me, that has all kinds of problems, because I've watched cranes on construction sites, and sometimes it's windy, and the things move around a bit. And how they're going to line up these concrete blocks, I'm not quite sure how they're going to make that work. But anyway, I mean, the point is, innovation is happening. They're building a pilot plant. They've got some venture funding to try it out. We'll see whether it works or not. So
that is a game. I'd like that as the new next gen Jenga. It's a lot of fun.
I mean, to be fair, each block weighs something like 10 tons. So, you know, you kind of... So there's that. For a long time, we've used spinning masses, so flywheels. Now, they tend to be not good for long-term storage, but they're great for balancing frequency and things like that. Because we used to have, in the old traditional model, we had a lot of spinning metal on the grid. They were called power stations. So when things moved around a bit and you got some change in frequency and possible loss of synchronization, which would take a power station out of the grid because it would not be able to stay on the grid. That kind of problem was to some extent managed by the fact you had big lumps of metal spinning around in the power station. Now we don't have big lumps of metal. So again, there's a whole bunch of technologies. You can have ultra high speed flywheels that can respond in a millisecond, and they can deal with the subtlest fluctuations of what's going on the grid. You can have big, heavy lumps of metal. And there's one, it's called, what's it called? Concentrator, I think. It's in Ireland, and it is literally a big spinning, fairly slowly spinning lump of metal that smooths out the fluctuations caused by having renewables on the grid. and does the job very, very well. You wouldn't use it for long-term storage because it's hard to keep things spinning, but for these short-term fluctuations. Batteries, of course, we know about, and because of the falling price of things like lithium-ion, lithium phosphate batteries, and with sodium sulfide and a whole bunch of new chemistries coming along, plus redox batteries, which are a different kind of battery that use tanks of reagents to store the energy. Those, because the price has been dropping dramatically, more of that is being installed than any other kind of storage at the moment. And the expectation is kind of around 2030, maybe a little later, that battery storage will be the biggest single form of storage on the grid. And people are building, combined systems. They're building big solar power plants backed up with battery so that they can carry on during the night. Many different kind of dimensions and models, but a lot of these things are going up to kind of 1 gigawatt hour of storage. I mean, serious storage, getting up to the size of a pumped hydro unit. Most of them are much smaller. And as I've said, we also have people with individual batteries in their own home, like I do. My battery just holds 10 kilowatts. But, again, living in a rural area, if I have a power outage, it's extremely useful to have 10 kilowatt hours of power sitting on a little unit strapped to the wall. So there's that. You can, again, for fairly fast response, you can use ultracapacitors. So you can use something which is like a capacitor. A lot of these things are what you find driving your watch at the moment. Tend to have fewer batteries now. Your watch has got a little solar panel in it. It's charging an ultracapacitor, and that kind of keeps the watch going. But essentially, you can scale this up, and you can make this into any size you want, because you just build out. You just keep adding cells. So they're being looked at. They're already used a lot for regenerative braking in buses and things like that. So they're the temporary store because actually they have a longer life and a better duty cycle than the kind of batteries. Batteries don't like to be charged to the absolute maximum, and they don't like being discharged to the maximum, and they don't like being swapped around backwards and forwards very fast. They really hate that. Chemistry is not good at that kind of thing. So the ultracapacitors kind of handle the short-term fluctuations in these vehicles, take the power back from the regenerative braking, help the vehicle start again, and then you kind of use the battery for the slower response. And again, we're seeing those kind of hybrid systems building up. What else have we got? What haven't I talked about yet? Fairly exotic superconducting magnets. Once you've charged up a coil in a superconducting magnet, the energy will stay there for quite a long time. You do have to keep it very cold, which costs some energy. But again, instantaneous response. You can get megawatts out of that, bang, in milliseconds. And so again, for stabilizing these much more diffuse and dispersed grids and keeping everything running smoothly, they have their uses. And the Japanese have installed quite a lot of these. And I think China's looking at those now as well. Yeah, they have their use. So there's all these different technologies. And finally, for really long, I forgot compressed air. Right? So, all these gas fields and oil wells that are exhausted and all these salt caverns we've got. Well, you can compress air and feed it into one of these caverns where it will stay. And then when you want it back out, you just let it out through a turbine and it will drive a turbine. Now, there's some complexities to that because the air gets hot when you compress it and it gets cold when you allow it to expand again, as anybody who's ever used a bicycle pump will know. But they are soluble problems. And I don't have much faith in that one because I think that we've been testing it for 50 years now. And there's still just a few test units and test sites. Don't think we've solved the problem. Much more interesting is storing it actually as heat. So there's a company which takes conventional refrigeration equipment and uses it to make liquid air. So liquid air is something which is a commodity product used throughout industry, and they just take spare electricity, make liquid air, and then when you want the energy back, you allow that to evaporate, volume increases dramatically. Hey, I can drive a turbine. And the nice thing about that is it doesn't require a salt cavern or an empty oil well or anything like that. You can put it anywhere you like and it looks just like a chemical plant. So very, very simple. There are ideas of using heat alone. So you have two reservoirs, a hot reservoir and a cold reservoir, usually filled with rocks. And you use a heat engine to, a bit like your heat pump, to actually cool one down and heat up the other. And then again, when you want the energy back, you allow it to re-equilibrate. You use that temperature difference to drive the heat pump in reverse. And hey, you've got electricity again. And a lot of these will have kind of efficiencies 80, 90%. So you actually get back a hell of a lot of what you put into them. So that, you know, they're pretty efficient, much more efficient than using fossil fuels to drive a power station. The last one is generally called power to X, and that's making molecules out of spare electricity. And people talk about, oh, you can make ammonia, you can make methanol, you can make methane, you can make hydrogen, but actually it all starts with the hydrogen. So you make green hydrogen and then you've got a choice of turning it into one of these other things, some of which have advantages for some application. The problem with these is, well, I think what's going to happen with these is people need hydrogen. So the chemical industry, the steel industry needs hydrogen to decarbonize. I don't think, could be wrong, I don't think that there's going to be much of a market in the short term for producing hydrogen and then using a fuel cell to get the electricity back, because that has a round trip efficiency of only between 40 to 50%. So you lose so much making hydrogen and turning it back into electricity. But making hydrogen and using that to make steel, you're really saving some carbon by doing that, because it means you don't need coking coal. And since that's already being done by commercial companies, it's not entirely clear to me why we need a new coal mine in Cumbria, because I don't care if it's coking coal for steel making, there won't be a market.
No. And I think, you know, as you were speaking there were two things that really struck me. When Leonardo da Vinci was looking at how to tackle the many problems of Milan, including the hydrological issues, he looked at what we would call energy storage. He looked at hydro. He looked at, he sketched out devices made of wood that would store the water high, and then obviously that the energy released from that, gravity devices. And this feels to me as if we are on the cusp of a renaissance, another renaissance, an energy renaissance. The only difference now is the scale and some of the materials that we're using, yeah. But effectively, these are just the same fundamental processes. This is going back to what you were speaking about with flows. This is about creating a system where you're moving things around as and when
you need an energy difference. If you can create an energy difference, you can exploit it. And it's really all about creating that energy difference in some way. I mean, a spinning flywheel, you know, has rotational energy, which is different to the things which are not spinning round. So again, you've got a energy difference that you can use. And I think that the thing that has impressed me most is everything I've mentioned to you now is actually already in use commercially. These are not dreams. The dreams are out there. The dreams are something different. The next generation of ultracapacitors, which will have 4 times the energy density. The next generation of batteries that will be 1/10 the cost, and things like that. So there's a lot of next generational stuff, which is all going to bring benefits. But all these technologies are being commercially exploited today. So when people say, storage, you kind of go, oh, what's the problem? There may be a cost problem or a practicality in a particular location, but with all the choices you've got to choose from, there's a way around the problem. So yeah, that's just one of my frustrations at the moment.
And getting on, so there's another area that you have a lot of expertise in, and that's decarbonising the chemical industry. Tell us a bit about that, because I think that's one of the subjects that I would say hasn't got nearly enough visibility. So
yeah. So the chemical, I mean, some people react very badly when you say the word chemicals, but chemicals are pretty essential to the way we live. Our world is built out of chemicals, and the majority of the moment come from oil and gas. But the important thing about them is that the energy which is used to make them is only part of the story. So 14% of the oil market in the world and 8% of the gas is used to make chemicals. But 60% of the carbon in that oil and gas goes into the product. We build the chemical products substantially out of carbon. And that means that only 40% obviously is used for the energy to make things. And that's the bit which is being decarbonized quite rapidly. Because people are going, well, electricity is going to be decarbonized by 2035 or something. That's fine. We'll run our factory that way. And that means that part of it will be dealt with. So for the chemical industry, they're kind of beginning to turn their focus away from the energy, almost treating it as a solved problem. Yeah, there are efficiency issues, there's all kind of bits and pieces, but essentially treating that as a solved problem and saying, what are we going to do about this 6% of carbon that's in the product? Because we're using virgin fossil fuels to make that. And as we go to battery electric vehicles and other forms of transportation, and as we decarbonize electricity production, all kinds of other things, we won't be using oil and gas for those purposes. So the bit that goes into being chemicals becomes bigger and bigger. So it's kind of one of those tail problems in decarbonization, which everyone can see is out there. Not quite sure what to do about it yet. And the other problem, in a sense, is where those chemicals are used. So actually, 65% of those chemicals go into plastics, which is kind of, obviously you've got microplastics, you've got landfill, you've got all kinds of problems with that. But in principle, a hell of a lot of that can be recycled. If we could bring it back, then chemists are quite good at breaking things apart and rebuilding it. So we could reuse that. Quite a lot, about 20 to 30%, goes into products like cleaning products, detergents, soaps, oils, stuff that we use on a day-to-day basis. And whether we like it or not, the fate of most of that material is to go down the drain. And because we don't like releasing forever chemicals into the environment, they're designed to be biodegradable. And that makes an interesting problem, because you're taking, so you can take one chunk of it and say, well, the plastics, we can make the plastics, we can use the plastic. If we got good at recycling the plastics, we'd need less virgin fossil carbon to make them. So we can start to create a circular economy. With detergents and shampoos and things you can't. It's all going to go down the drain. It's all going to break down into carbon dioxide quite quickly. So there's a kind of part of that market which is designed to take fossil carbon and turn it into carbon dioxide in the atmosphere about as fast as you can. So we need to think about these things. Now, that one of the interesting things which I think many people outside chemicals don't appreciate is that essentially with the chemicals we make from petroleum products, oil and gas, they're all made by 7 commodity intermediates. So we take the oil and gas, we make fuel out of it, make a whole bunch, but we make 7 commodity intermediates. So we make ammonia, methanol, ethylene, propylene, benzene, toluene, and xylene. And that comes out of the basic oil refinery. Everything else, the thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of chemicals we make, all start life pretty much as those 7 intermediates. So one of the interesting ideas out there is, how could we make those 7 intermediates without using fossil carbon? Because if we could do that, then the rest of the chemical industry can carry on doing all its useful things in the way it's used to. We don't have to kind of have a completely different process. So one of the approaches to that is some work going on amongst the industry, talking about something called a renewable carbon refinery. So how could you make the feedstock to what is currently a petrochemical refinery be renewable carbon? And there are some interesting ideas about how you do that. So if you take largely organic waste, say municipal waste or waste plastic or things like that, if you heat it in the absence of air, you can produce some gases and liquids which look like what goes into a chemical plant anyway, almost identical. So there's a material called syngas, synthesis gas, which is carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and a bit of methane, that is key to making all these intermediates and making all the rest. And basically, they're materials which have one carbon atom in them, and chemists have got pretty good at sticking those together like popper beads to make much, much bigger structures. So, can we make syngas out of wood waste, agricultural waste, municipal waste? Yeah, we can. And that means, and there are companies out there doing this right now, looking at making a sort of non-fossil fuel kerosene for long-haul aircraft. And the pilot plants are out there and they're making this stuff. There have been experiments making diesel, making a synthetic diesel using this. And so there's a whole bunch of area of work called e-fuels, which is for those systems which we cannot switch to hydrogen or battery or whatever quickly. And the 2 examples are basically long-haul aviation and long-haul shipping. We can make products which are not made from fossil fuels. So we're not adding to the inventory in the atmosphere in the same way. So lots of interest in doing that kind of thing. And again, once you've got these key ingredients, then off you go. And so there's this whole process thinking about how we do that. Other ideas connected with that: can you do direct air capture of carbon dioxide? Because carbon dioxide is a key part of these overall processes. The answer is yes. So if you are in a place that's generating carbon dioxide in a concentrated way, so it's in the effluent from your plant, you can capture it pretty efficiently, and you can then feed it into these kinds of processes and make things out of it. And so instead of talking about carbon capture and storage, people are increasingly talking about carbon capture use and storage. So the storage is the last resort, because we can turn it into useful things and avoid using fossil carbon for that. So that is actively being researched. The most desirable one will be direct air capture, where we have something that you suck air from the atmosphere at one end and it strips out all the carbon dioxide. We don't have that yet, but people are playing around with the chemistry and the physics that would be required to do that. And if we can achieve direct air capture, then we can start recycling the carbon here into chemical products, which then might get released. The other approach to the whole problem is to say, well, let's not go through the 7 intermediates at all. Let's use enzymes. Let's use biological process. Let's start with sugar and starch and biological feedstocks that have come from growing plants. And we'll use enzymes and low energy processes, and we'll convert those into ingredients. And there's a huge amount of work going on, particularly as it happens in the area of surfactants. So things that make, washing up liquids and foams and cleaning products and shampoos and all that, where there are quite a number of biologically derived materials already in use and have been for 20, 30 years. And they're used because of their particular properties, because they're often very mild and very gentle on the skin and things like that. But the same idea could be used to create a wider range of materials. And so there's a whole bunch of people, and it's interesting, you've got one group of people who are the existing petrochemical industry, who are saying, what we'd like to do is take all this organic waste and turn it into something we understand, and then we'll make all the molecules. The other group of people are people like Archer Daniel Midland, Cargill. They come from the food industry. They're used to handling agricultural materials, sugars and starches and oils and cellulosic waste and all the things. And they're coming, well, we know how to handle this stuff. If we put the right chemistry on top of that, we can create, they're not the same molecules that people are used to, but they have equivalent functionality. And so they're kind of playing around with that idea. And those two strands are developing independently. It's going to be quite interesting to see what happens. And then in the longer term future, there's always been an interest in making useful molecules by fermentation. Generally, the way this has been done has been by mutating things like yeasts so that they are in some way unhappy and they produce the material you're interested in. The problem with that is they're often a bugger to keep alive because you've messed around with them, so their metabolism isn't in a good place. They don't grow very well, and you have to look after them very, very carefully. But you can do it. There's something called synthetic biology, which is being explored for this, where people are talking about, no, leave the bug with its existing metabolism. What we'll do is we'll graft something onto it, put it into its DNA, which will make the molecule we're interested in. They call it a cassette. So you plug it in and it adds an extra piece of metabolism to the bug that makes the molecule you're interested in. And right now, I think it's Edinburgh University is doing a lot of work in this space, and they have libraries of metabolic pathways that they can plug into yeasts and E. coli and things like that, things you would use in a standard fermentation process. And they started experimenting with polymer ingredients. So things that would go into functional polymers. Obviously, mind-bogglingly expensive at the moment. And maybe it will remain so, I don't know. But it's another completely different approach to the problem of how we make the materials. And the attraction of that is that the problem with using agricultural materials as a feedstock for chemistry is once you start talking about industrial chemistry, you're talking about millions of tons. And so you have issues of competition for foodstuffs. Basically it's the palm oil story all over again, right? You haven't got enough of it because we're using it for both industrial processes and for human and animal nutrition. So we need more palm oil, so we chop down the virgin rainforest to provide it. So the issues with the agricultural model of land use, competition for resources, impact on biodiversity and things like that, which these total fermentation routes, just like lab-grown meat might be a route to solving some of those problems, that these fermentation routes may be an end run around the whole problem. But it's fascinating because, as you say, it's not talked about very much, but actually our society cannot survive without all these chemicals. We're going to have to get them from somewhere. It's going to become an increasing part of the fossil carbon burden. So the question comes, how do we do it? And there are these really three fundamentally different routes, two quite well established, and this outlier of synthetic biology, which may be an answer. But nobody's done it yet.
No. And what strikes me at this, George Monbiot he's been championing a new project, hasn't he, for fermentation and exactly what you're talking on the food front, with the objective to massively reduce the world's carbon emissions through the essentially displacement of the livestock industry through creating alternative protein source. And I've noticed in that there's been a backlash by some on what is effectively an ideological premise because they don't understand the actual science of this. And the extraordinary thing about that is that I've noticed that some of those that are really knocking the idea and knocking George for it is what they're not bearing in mind here is the sheer scale, not only of the environmental damage that is done through the carbon emissions, but obviously the degradation of the landscapes. And with that, the animal cruelty and the fact that through these new processes, we could potentially eradicate the factory farm, which isn't necessarily to say that you're going to displace farming altogether, but that mass farming, as we know it, could be knocked out of the ballpark, where we're embracing a completely new way of doing it. One of the things I noticed in I think the report is called Replant or something, isn't it? It's something like that. Came out a couple of weeks ago, and what that really sort of highlighted was the fact that these fermentation units could effectively be very localized. They could be like micro energy plants. We could have, one in every town or whatever, but the scale of productivity of these things could be huge. It strikes me that with that as well, it feeds in something bigger here, because when you were talking about aviation fuel, I can't say the project, but something I've been working on is coming out quite soon with a quite well-known entity. And we've been looking at the future of travel. And in that project, one of the things I was very conscious of was that as a designer and someone that works with STEM, I don't see the flying issue as sort of an ethical one. I see it simply as a design problem. And, we can design out the problems. We just have to embrace new engineering, new science, and new fuel. But for some people, ideologically, they want people to stop flying, and there's a very sort of belligerent attitude to this.
Well, it's back to the problem of people being in silos, isn't it? I mean, people have a particular. It's kind of like, it's unfair, but it's kind of save the whales.
Yeah.
Right. It's not save the oceans. It's save the whales. So you pick something that you think you can impact, and you refuse to think about anything else. One of the huge problems that we experience with sites of special scientific interest and nature reserves in the UK is actually pretty knock-down, drag-out arguments between the enthusiasts for the different forms of life which are using it. And again, the systems thinking is not there. So people are saying, well, we should or we should not have raptors because we've got rare birds. Well, I'm sorry, raptors are there, and we'll ignore insects. We'll take out the plants. We'll take out the plants that mean that make it harder for the small mammals to live, and we'll have more of an open pasture. Oh, look, we've just knocked out an entire colony of rare butterflies because they actually need the wood edge to live on. So it's back to this thing about people wanting to simplify the problem to something they can cope with. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's with synthetic meat and things like that, there's the whole yuck factor. I mean, got to admit, there is a certain amount of yuck factor to it. If you're used to eating a steak and thinking about where it comes from. Of course, more increasingly, people are repelled by the yuck factor of eating a steak in the first place. But there is a yuck factor, there's the whole GM thing, there's the whole 'tis flying in the face of nature. It's not how we've done things in the past. There is that kind of traditional view of things. This infects everything we look at. People, as you say, take an ideological position on something. Yeah, if we all lived in 15-minute cities, it would be great. But Los Angeles isn't a 15-minute city, and there's no chance of having a really effective mass public transit system in Los Angeles in the immediate future. So right now, battery electric vehicles are a good idea. Yes, I understand that having fewer cars in total would be good, and you can do things with car clubs and various things to help that, and maybe the autonomous vehicles will start to solve some of those problems if anybody ever figures out how to do it. But saying you shouldn't have a car to someone living in Los Angeles is simply pointless.
Yeah, and I think in the UK, obviously for people in cities, when I was living in Manchester and when I've been in London, I don't need a car. I wouldn't have a car. There's no point having a car. But certainly when you're living in a rural area, because of the fact that the train network was stripped out, because of the fact that the bus route can't run economically if it's running as frequently as people need it, you have to have diversified transport solutions. And so again, I like diversity. I think we have to have an ecosystem. It's like with energy, there has to be diversity. We have to take a sophisticated view to it. And actually from the perspective of creating resilience, the more engineered the system is, the more likely it is to break down. But if we have diversity, then we've got resilience.
I like the model of life. I like the way in which mutations are occurring constantly. And most of them fail most of the time, or don't confer any advantage. But once in a while, a mutation is really useful, and it then spreads. And that is how that kind of ability to flip the way you are surviving in your environment is kind of key to life. And I think it should be key to our technologies as well. I think we should view our technologies as being in that kind of Darwinian evolutionary process. You know, everyone probably taught at school the classic example of the melanistic pepper moth, where in the Victorian times, when there was soot everywhere, there is a mutant which is melanistic, which is black, rather than being white and grey. And normally it kind of stands out like a sore thumb, so it gets eaten. But they keep cropping up, and every generation there'll be a few of these melanistic ones, and mostly they get eaten. Victorian time comes along with the Industrial Revolution. There's soot everywhere. Suddenly they're at an advantage, and so they take over. But they don't. The mutations are still happening, so there's the white version, the albino version, is still floating around. It still keeps cropping up, and most of it gets eaten. Comes along the Clean Air Acts, clean up the buildings, clean up the air, clean up the trees, not so, and the original version comes back again. And that ability to flip, to change, to keep trying things, so that these alternative approaches are bubbling under the whole time. That's why I take comfort from the fact that people are talking about so many different solutions. I don't want people to say, this is the answer. We know what the answer is. This is how we're going to do it. It's what scares the willies out of me with geoengineering. You know, because it's kind of a trapdoor process. Once you start, you might not be able to stop. And I think diversity, as you say, is absolutely key to solving the problems we face. And diversity of communities, diversity of cities, diversity of designs. You know, I'm afraid that I've forgotten the name of the famous Swiss-French guy who built the slab buildings in the middle of the last century.
Le Corbusier?
Le Corbusier, yeah. The problem with him was not that he came up with a new idea. The problem was he knew the answer and was very good at persuading people he knew the answer. And actually, you know, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work in other situations and for other communities. So I think the diversity is hugely, hugely important. You know, I don't care whether it's timber or straw insulation or rammed, you know, or concrete recycled, or, you know, rethinking the life cycle of buildings so we do things a different way. I don't care. Just let it, you know, let it work in the environment, and we'll see which solutions survive. We don't have to make any solution the answer.
No, absolutely. And having different solutions, one of the things I shared earlier this month were a couple of live streams on how to insulate your home ad hoc, depending on whether or not you had a heritage building or a modern building. And one of the reasons I did that is, I think you might have noticed it as well. There's a massive damp and condensation and mold problem in the UK. And obviously that is very specifically a problem of the architectures in the particular climate that they're in. And I noticed actually on some of the news reports that some of the flats that had black mold growing and heavy condensation had closed over the vents in their windows. And I thought, you know, what a shame it is that we should really have agents that are going around, not just inspecting for health and safety and doing so regularly, but actually helping people to understand, how can I actually make my home, given what I've got, less likely to have these problems by creating ventilation. I mean, I have DIY hacked. I've got cling film and bubble wrap on my single glazed heritage windows here because the temperatures have dropped. And frankly, apart from stopping black mold, I can't be bothered to wipe my windows every morning. Wipe all the condensation off. But it has actually, I've been doing a little experiment, and it's kept an extra 2 degrees in the flat since I've done it.
Yeah. Yeah.
As well as, and I think, you know, things like this could be done very simply. And although they are absolutely not a permanent solution, they are little hacks that people could be making to cope with what we've got at the moment, and just these incremental steps. But as I explained in the little live streams, what works for heritage building is not right for a modernist building, and so forth. So you need to have the diversity. I just have one more question for you, Richard, because I know we've gone over time. There is one subject that I know, again, you're expert in, and that I know some of the people that will watch this have a very strong interest in. And that is the fact that at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about using biomaterials, bioplastics, and the idea that when these are released into the environment, they're always going to be better than chemical plastics. Now, can you give us a little window as to why that's not always the case?
So the key is how they degrade. So there's a whole bunch of quotes bioplastics or biodegradable plastics, which are in fact nothing of the kind. They're called oxo-degradable. They have catalysts built into them, and when sunlight strikes them, they gradually break down into pieces. So it breaks up the structure. That is not biodegradable. One thing that does is just generate huge amounts of microplastics. So that's something I would happily see taken out, strangled as an idea. Other materials, it depends how they break down. So there are packaging materials, some of the starch-based packaging materials, which are almost water soluble. They do literally fall apart. Now that means they have limited areas of application, but they do fall apart. There are plastics based on cellulose, which bugs are very, very happy eating, and will eventually make those vanish altogether. I think that there's a problem with plastics, bioplastics that are designed to be strong and resistant, because there are applications where you'd quite like them to be strong and resistant, in that they just do not break down in the way people expect. And in particular, they don't break down in home composting. They only break down in relatively high temperature composting, which even most local authorities don't have the facilities to provide. So it's pretty much an industrial process. And I think that so BASF, to take an example, is pushing a circular plastic economy using some of the techniques I talked about. So taking plastic waste, breaking it down and rebuilding it. That will have less impact potentially on the environment than a bioplastic. People goes, oh, this is biodegradable, and chucking it out into the road. So there's a difference between what's called ready biodegradability, which is a very strict standard that a lot of these materials that go down the drain have to adhere to, which means it's gone pretty quickly, and ultimate biodegradability, that says if you feed it to the right bugs for long enough under the right conditions they like, it will vanish. And I think that we at the moment are mixing the categories up, and so that means that the materials are going to break down into microplastics, and with all the problems we know that entails. They might eventually vanish, unlike some of the non-biodegradable plastics, which will be microplastics forever, but they will be microplastics for a period of time. There are other issues. One of the large contributors to microplastics in the ocean is actually residues from tires.
I know, we worked on a report. Yeah. I cited you.
But it's a serious problem, and you have to think about solutions for that, because you've got fillers in there, you've got all kinds of engineering materials, you've got natural rubber which will break down, you've got synthetic rubber, some of which will break down, some of which won't, but they won't break down quickly, and all that debris is being washed into the sewer system and ultimately ending up in the oceans. So we've got to keep working on it.
Yeah.
Again, I'm nervous about people who say, take the ideological position of all packaging is bad. Because I just don't see how you're going to run a society without packaging. And you're not going to run a society without non-biodegradable plastics. You know, I mean, the devices we're talking to each other through now are full of non-biodegradable plastics. We have to get better at recycling them, but we can't imagine a future in which we only use wood and cotton and sisal and hemp and linseed and flax and a bit of rock, and that's all we use to build our world. It's not going to happen. So we have to keep working on identifying the problems, identifying the major problems, and looking at what we're going to do about them. So I personally have a hatred of oxo-degradable plastics because I think it's a complete con. I think bioplastics, the interesting problem is when they become a contaminant in a recycled plastic stream. So some of the people I talked to about recycling plastics would almost prefer that there were no bioplastics because they really mess up their recycling process. And that's a problem. That's a problem. So don't have any solutions, but you know, nothing is easy. But we could do better. There's no reason. I can't remember. Somebody did tell me the loading of microfibers that goes into the environment from washing machines. It's quite substantial. We could fix that. That's an engineering problem. You know, we have filters that can handle that. This is not a problem. You know, we've got filters that can handle more of the plastic at the, instead of coarse screens, we could use finer filters and different filtering methods at our waste plants, at our wastewater plants. Lots of things that we can do that can reduce the impact of these problems in a useful way.
Yeah.
But I don't have an answer. Sorry, there's no chemical magic wand I can wave that sorts that one out.
On the tyres, I did do some work after that report.
Yeah.
And I do have a few suggestions for how we might address that issue that drew on. Obviously, there were over 30 people, 30 experts we consulted on that report. And I'm looking for somewhere to park it. So it's sat there. I mean, I might just publish it open access, but it would be nice. I think with so many of these things, I think we need more opportunities to convene experts. We need more spaces for experimentation, and particularly for creating these complex environments. I mean, in essence, we can design the systems, the energy integration with the building, with the utilities. This for us is not so much the challenge in that we've got the fundamental understanding to do that. What we actually need is the spaces and the funding and the time made to do it. And I know some institutions are making some headway on this. I love the fact, you know, up at Salford, they've got their energy lab with a couple of houses in it, and they can throw different weather conditions at them and so forth. But I think we need more of this, and I think it would be really lovely to see the corporate sector actually now, from sort of putting together lots of reports, lots of conversations, convening lots of round tables, to actually doing more collaborative research, and possibly even, you know, I know a number of companies were sort of every 6 months we're hearing of a corporate that is opening up a lab, and it'd be really lovely if those labs were sites not just for conversations and their own internal research, but we actually convened more of the expertise.
I think one of the areas that needs most attention is government policy, because there is a willingness to change, but of course there's enormous risk if you try and change when the market is not changing with you. So there'll be a tendency to hang back and say, well, okay, I can do this, but I don't want to be the first, you know, or not yet. You have to apply pressure, and that's what governments are for, is to say, you know, if the government said, we are going to set out a plan to get to net zero domestic properties, you know, homes, which is a big chunk of the carbon emissions in the UK, largely through heating. We're going to have a plan to do that by 2050, because clearly we have to meet our obligations. And this is what we're going to do. And like you say, support the hard to treat, provide guidance, provide the one-stop shop, provide all those things. Industry will supply it and will follow. If you say, we need to make this change, and we're not going to make you do it because we're against that kind of thing, we just would rather like you to, that's a difficult one. Because there will always, it's the tragedy of the commons. There will always be those who will refuse, and then, you know, they kind of take the extra profits in the short term. It's not a long-term strategy, but they can really screw things up in the short term. So you need policy. You need policy which is consistent, needs to be long-term. It's got to be longer than a parliament, and it should be outcome oriented. So it shouldn't say you should do X, it should say we need you to provide an answer that gives this performance or this carbon reduction or whatever it happens to be. Because generally the ability of civil servants, or indeed anybody, to actually pick the winning technologies 25 years in advance is pretty small. We need to set objectives and say, this is what, you know, you have to deliver, don't care how you do it. And that has to be consistent over time.
Really?
Because companies in the UK, I mean, think about the tailpipe emissions from, you know, passenger vehicles in Europe. Yeah, okay, there was VW and there was some cheating and all the rest of it. But generally, that consistent, you know, you have to meet this standard, and then 5 years later you have to meet this standard, and it's going all the way, has had a profound influence on what got designed, what got manufactured, what got researched, and what made it to the market. It is a brilliant example of the power of long-range policy, which is outcome-oriented. Didn't tell them what they had to do to their engines, just said you can't have more than this carbon emission coming out the tailpipe, and this much nitrous oxide and all the other things. So yeah, there were some people cheating. But I think that's been a great success, and we have never in the UK done anything like that with buildings or many other areas of our economy.
No, and it's such a missed opportunity, because when you have goals like that, then it does incentivize people, it does create that push, and we are very capable of generating the ideas, you know, when we've got those policy frameworks in place.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I used to be in industrial R&D. When you're told you don't have a choice, you come up with answers. It's amazing how creative you can be when you continuing in business depends on it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's going to be interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, politically for the UK, it's been an incredibly tumultuous time. It's been extremely fraught for now a good few years. This year is looking again very contentious. You know, I wouldn't really want to hedge too many bets as to what's going to be going on in September, but I certainly think that at the moment we have the signs that there's going to be a fracture, because we've got so many major issues that are not being resolved, and the populace is not happy about this. I know we Brits are known for sort of keeping a stiff upper lip, and, you know, supposedly queuing and being terribly orderly, but certainly when you look at British history, when the populace shifts that opinion, we get the kickbacks, and we've got lots of signs of that. So I think it's going to be interesting, and my hope is
we can become very French if we're pushed hard enough.
We can become very French. I think we're being more French than the French at the moment. That's the comment that some are making. But I'm just really hoping that the sooner the better. Come the summer, we've reached that peak of contention and of collapse, because we really need to come out very quickly, don't we? We need to start coming out of this now and getting the stability, getting the cathedral thinking, getting really, I mean, obviously in some areas of policy, the government is pro-science. And if we look at what's going on in Cornwall, we look at the space project down there, couldn't get more scientific. But then obviously the rhetoric that we've had has been very anti-science in some areas of politics in Britain in the last couple of years. So yeah, it would be really nice, I think, for us to be in a situation where, you know, the big picture, as it were, politically and policy-wise that we're working in is more supportive of the things that we're trying to create here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, let's get the challenge clear. Let's pick our targets and stick to them, and we can do this. There's, you know, there's the amount of innovation out there is astonishing, from tiny little ideas that simply improve putting up a house and getting energy efficiency, you know, through to completely redesigning the electricity supply system. We can do this stuff, but we can't do it if there's no goal.
Absolutely. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, Richard. I'd love to speak with you later in the year again, and let's hope that some of the things that, you know, we've discussed here move forward, and that hopefully this conversation will help to give a bit more visibility to some of the really important things that you have raised in this session. So thank you for your time, and thank you to everybody who's joined us and that will see this video. If you have any comments, please share them.
And thank you to all the people listening. You know, I hope it was an interesting conversation for you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.